On that sultry late afternoon, the suburban streets were silent, as if something were about to happen, but no one knew yet. Among the few walking along the sidewalks was a man with hurried steps, a restless look, and a shopping cart that seemed too heavy for what it was supposed to carry. Around him, no one seemed to pay attention. No one except Jacob Williams, a black boy of just 10 years old who observed everything with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Unlike the others, Jacob sensed something strange about this behavior, something that didn't fit, something that made him want to understand what was happening, even without knowing exactly why. He began following the man at a safe distance, without attracting attention, but paying attention to every detail. The way he looked around, the way he clutched his hands on the cart, the way he avoided eye contact with anyone who approached. The boy wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he felt deep in his heart that he had to act. And it was precisely this intuition, this pure instinct of caution and courage, that led him to make a quick call to the police. What the agents found when they intercepted the man and checked the contents of that cart was something so shocking, so unexpected, that it completely changed the course of the investigation that no one even knew existed. And now, the burning question: what exactly did Jacob see? What was hidden in that cart that went unnoticed by everyone but him? If you also believe that a child's sensitivity can see what the world insists on ignoring, like now and subscribe to the channel, because this story will shake your deepest emotions. Jacob Williams was a 12-year-old boy living in a small apartment on the outskirts of Baltimore, in a neighborhood where row houses shared thin walls and neighbors grew accustomed to the constant sounds of fighting, sirens, and old engines. The only child of a single mother who worked double shifts at a local hospital, he learned early on to fend for himself, making his own breakfast and taking care of small household chores while his mother was away most of the day. His father's absence was a silence as heavy as the neighborhood's dimly lit streets, a void Jacob filled with his attentive observation of the world around him. At school, he wasn't the student who drew attention for his top scores, nor the popular kid who made people laugh in the hallways. Instead, he was the one who preferred to sing along, the one who almost never raised his hand to answer, even when he knew the answer. Many teachers saw him as distracted, unable to focus, unaware that his mind was constantly racing, picking up details that even adults missed. The way a classmate's mood would suddenly change, the way a teacher hid nervousness behind an automatic smile, or even the way neighbors would talk in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. This sensitivity, rather than being valued, was often met with ridicule. When Jacob said something was off, he received disdainful looks. When he pointed out suspicious behavior, he was accused of having an overactive imagination. He silently carried the pain of being invisible, of having his word dismissed simply for being a black child in a community where so many voices similar to his had been ignored. This burden shaped his way of being, silent on the outside, but attentive to every detail on the inside. There was also the relationship with his mother, Maria Williams, an exhausted woman who loved her son deeply but often didn't have time to see his anguish. Her weary look upon returning from work spoke volumes about a life of invisible struggles. Jacob understood, even without words, that he couldn't burden her with his own perceptions, and so he kept what he saw to himself. That particular morning, when he spotted the man with the covered cart, this whole story became even more significant. After all, would he be discredited again if he tried to talk about what he'd noticed? Or perhaps it was precisely this ability to notice what no one else sees that would make him, even if only for a moment, impossible to ignore. As he walked along the narrow sidewalk, Jacob's gaze remained fixed on the man advancing a few meters ahead of him. The cart's movement was uncomfortable to watch. It creaked on its rusty wheels and swayed in unison with the stranger's hurried steps. Each time the uneven asphalt caused the canvas to shift, Jacob felt a pang in his stomach, as if something were about to reveal itself. That dark fabric not only hid its contents, but seemed to scream silence, like a makeshift curtain guarding secrets. The boy watched the man's posture closely, his shoulders hunched, his breathing heavy, his eyes constantly searching for escape routes. It wasn't the manner of someone simply carrying groceries or old clothes to be donated. There was something in his gestures that conveyed urgency, as if each step were a calculated act of someone needing to quickly rid themselves of a burden they didn't want discovered. Jacob felt his heart race. It was as if the very atmosphere around him had become denser, more charged with mystery. At one point, the man stopped abruptly, looked over his shoulder, and stared for a few seconds at the street behind him. Jacob, startled, leaned against a wall, pretending to tie his shoelaces to avoid arousing suspicion. The bread in his hands no longer mattered. His breath caught, and he almost thought he would be noticed, but the man walked again, faster and faster, as if aware of being watched, albeit subtly. Jacob's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Was he just exaggerating? How many times had he been accused of making up stories or seeing problems where none existed? Part of him wanted to turn his back and go home, forgetting the scene. But another, stronger part told him that ignoring it could mean turning a blind eye to something serious. His intuition wasn't the product of an overactive imagination. It was a warning that vibrated intensely within him. And it was when the canvas moved differently, almost as if something inside had a life of its own, that Jacob felt a certainty explode in his chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a man bothered by the weight of his groceries. There was something more, something that needed to be revealed. He knew he couldn't ignore it. But how could he act without being ridiculed once again? Jacob could no longer bear the uneasiness growing within him. The man's steps became faster and faster, almost like a silent escape, and the canvas seemed to move in intervals that betrayed a living secret. Clutching the bag of bread to his chest, he looked around for anyone who might overhear his suspicions. Across the street, an elderly woman walked slowly, leaning on a shopping bag. Jacob hurried over, his voice choked with fear and urgency. "Ma'am, that man, his cart. There's something strange there," he said, trying to convey the gravity of what he saw. The woman let out a short laugh, adjusting her glasses. "Oh boy, you watch too many mystery movies. Go home before your mother misses you." Her indifference washed over Jacob like a bucket of cold water. But he didn't give up. He walked faster until he reached a neighbor sweeping the front yard, a man accustomed to ignoring children playing in the street. "Mr. Davis, look at that man with the cart. Something's wrong, you need to see." The neighbor sighed, without even looking up. "Jacob, you should be studying instead of making up stories. He's just a man taking out the trash. Nothing more." The words echoed in Jacob's mind with the weight of so many other times he had been silenced. His chest tightened with the memory of the teachers who had told him to be quiet, the adults who had scolded him for being too imaginative. The pain of invisibility enveloped him once more, like a shadow impossible to dispel. Still, the scene before him wouldn't disappear. The man continued to drag the cart with nervous steps, his gaze lost, as if he feared discovery. Jacob knew he couldn't go home and pretend nothing had happened. Something inside him screamed that every second of hesitation could cost him dearly. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the figure that was moving further and further away. If no one would believe his word, then he would have to find another way. He might not be heard as he would have liked, but he could still act. Differently, silently, in his own way. And it was in that moment, faced with the weight of disbelief, that the decision was made that would change the course of that morning. Jacob would follow the man on his own, without telling anyone. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the man as he decided to take the first step toward what could be the greatest risk of his life. His heart was pounding, each beat echoing in his head like a warning drum. He knew that if discovered, he could be reprimanded, humiliated, or even threatened. But there was something stronger than fear, the conviction that ignoring him would be the worst choice. He clutched the bag of bread to his chest as if it were a courageous amulet and began walking discreetly, keeping a few feet away. The man walked through the narrow streets of the neighborhood, always looking sideways as if afraid of being followed. Jacob veered off course, hiding behind parked cars and lampposts. Every time the cart creaked over potholes in the asphalt, the tarp swayed and Jacob held his breath, wondering what might be hiding there. The silence between them was broken only by the sounds of the city. Distant horns, a dog barking, the hurried footsteps of strangers who paid no attention to the dark plot. With trembling hands, Jacob reached for the old cell phone he carried in his pocket. The scratched screen barely worked, but the camera still worked. He discreetly lifted the device and began recording the man, capturing every detail. The hunched posture, the anxious expression, the loosely tied tarp. It was as if he intuitively knew he needed proof because his word alone wouldn't be enough to convince anyone. The tension mounted at every turn. At one point, the man almost looked directly back, and Jacob had to duck behind a fence, his heart hammering so loudly he thought he could hear it. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and the boy wondered if he had the courage to continue. Still, each step the man took seemed to drag him deeper into a puzzle he could no longer escape. The path ended at a dead end, a deserted place surrounded by graffitied walls and abandoned houses. The man stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, and adjusted the tarp as if preparing his next move. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. He was getting closer and closer to whatever was hiding there. The boy huddled behind a thin tree, watching in absolute silence. His phone trembled in his hands, but it continued recording. With each passing second, the sense of danger grew, as if he were about to witness something that would change everything. Jacob knew he couldn't afford a misstep, that any noise would betray his presence. Still, a question lingered in his mind. What exactly was hidden under that tarp? Jacob remained motionless, hidden behind the thin tree that barely shielded him, while the scene ahead seemed to drag in slow motion. The man stopped, took a deep breath, and with a sudden movement, adjusted the ropes holding the tarp. It was then that Jacob heard the first sound. It wasn't the scrape of the cart against the asphalt or the creak of the wheels, but something different, muffled, a human noise that seemed to escape from within that makeshift hiding place. His eyes widened, and his entire body went rigid. He held his breath, trying to distinguish the sound from the distant street noises. Once more, the cart moved, and a faint groan escaped, like the sigh of someone exhausted. Jacob felt his stomach churn. There was no longer any doubt. There was life beneath that tarp. The boy's heart raced and his hands began to sweat. His mind spiraled between fear and courage. Part of him screamed to run home as fast as possible and forget everything, but another, even stronger part told him he was the only person who could do anything at that moment. The memories of being ignored came back to him like a cruel echo. You watch too many mystery movies. Stop making up stories. No one will believe you. But there, before their very eyes, there was no room for doubt or wild imagination. The canvas moved erratically, almost as if someone was struggling to breathe beneath it. Jacob bit his lip, his breathing ragged. He thought about his mother, about what she would say if she knew he was taking such a risk. He thought about the teachers who always told him he was absent-minded, and most of all, he thought about the possibility that there, inside that cart, a life could be in imminent danger. Swallowing down his fear, he tightened his grip on his cell phone, deciding he needed to get a little closer. He took short, silent steps until he could see the cart's outline more clearly. The canvas trembled, and now there was no denying it. Someone was there, trapped, suffocating amid black bags that looked more like garbage. The boy felt a wave of dread wash over his entire body, but along with it came the courage that had always been dormant. He could no longer retreat, could no longer pretend nothing was happening. He had to act, even if no one believed him at first. It was at that moment, as he watched in silence, that he made a decision that would change everything. Jacob felt his heart pounding wildly, each beat echoing in his ears like a war drum. He knew he had to act, but any misstep could turn that moment into a nightmare with no return. He decided he couldn't face the man alone. He needed help. Looking quickly around, he spotted the figure of a patrol officer walking. A few meters ahead, seemingly distracted, staring at the closed storefronts. Summoning all his courage, Jacob ran toward the officer, his breath short and his eyes wide. He grabbed the sleeve of his uniform and pointed toward the dead end. "Sir, please, the man over there. There's something in the cart. There's someone inside." The words came out quickly, full of desperation, but charged with conviction. The police officer, intrigued, frowned and looked in the indicated direction. With firm steps, he approached the man, who immediately showed signs of nervousness. His rigid posture and the sweat running down his face betrayed something was wrong. When he realized he was being watched, the man tried to hide it with a strained voice. "It's just trash, sir. I don't know why this kid is making up stories." But the tone of his speech was unconvincing. The man's gaze, as it briefly met Jacob's, was one of pure menace, as if silently saying, "If you hadn't gotten involved, none of this would be happening." The boy shivered, but didn't look away. For the first time, he faced someone who could end his silence forever, and yet he stood firm, as if courage itself had materialized within him. The officer asked the man to stop. "Open the tarp," he ordered, his voice firm, his hand close to his gun holster. The man hesitated, laughed nervously, and shook his head. "I told you it's just trash. I have nothing to hide." At that moment, Jacob felt the tension reach its breaking point. The heavy silence that hung over the alley seemed ready to explode in any direction. The man held the cart tightly, as if ready to flee, while the police officer prepared to intervene. Jacob knew he was facing a turning point. Either the truth would come out, or that secret would be dragged back into the shadows. And then, before any final moves could be made, something under the canvas stirred unmistakably, drawing a collective gasp from those nearby. The silence that gripped the dead-end street was broken only by the sudden movement beneath the tarp. The entire cart shuddered, as if something inside it had a life of its own, and the man's reaction was immediate. He tried to hold the ropes tighter, tightening the knots desperately, as if fearing a secret might be revealed against his will. The police officer, who'd been watching cautiously until then, took a firm step forward, his hand already resting on the gun at his belt. "I said open the tarp," he repeated more firmly, his tone full of authority. The man hesitated, took a deep breath, and shook his head. "It's no big deal. They're just garbage bags, please." His voice broke mid-sentence, as if the lie weighed more than his own body. Jacob, watching from a few feet away, felt his legs tremble, but his determination overcame his fear. He knew he was about to discover something that could change everything, something no one would ever believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. He clutched the bag of bread to his chest and bit his lip, holding back the urge to shout at the officer to stop him. With a brusque gesture, the police officer pulled the tarp aside. What had been hidden there, protected by black garbage bags and shrouded in layers of silence, finally came to light. Inside the stroller, lying awkwardly and pale-faced, was an unconscious child. The small body contrasted sharply with the somber surroundings. and for a moment the world seemed to stand still, the air filled with murmurs of shock. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine as he saw the victim's face, so frail, breathing heavily, but still alive. The officer immediately bent down, checking his vital signs, his firm voice now turning urgent. "We have a child. Call an ambulance, quick!" The man, realizing his secret had been exposed, tried to push the officer away and flee, but was restrained before he could take more than 2 steps. The brief struggle made the alley even more tense, the sound of screams and the thud of boots against the floor, echoing off the graffitied walls. Jacob watched with a racing heart, a mixture of horror and relief. His intuition had been right all along. The child, even unconscious, was irrefutable proof that Jacob wasn't making anything up. There was evidence no one could ignore, proof that transformed what had previously seemed like mere imagination into an act of quiet heroism. And as the ambulance siren began to echo in the distance, Jacob realized this was just the beginning of something even bigger. After all, the revelation wouldn't end there in the alley. What would happen when the entire neighborhood learned what had been found? The distant sound of the siren cut through the air like an inevitable call. Within minutes, the dead-end street that seemed forgotten by the city became a scene of commotion. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the screams and the unusual movement. First came hurried footsteps, then curious faces appeared at doors and windows, until dozens of eyes turned to the uncovered stroller. The image of the unconscious child, surrounded by black bags, spread a heavy silence among everyone. The murmurs began timidly, almost like a collective whisper. "My God, it's a child," a woman said, her hands over her mouth. Another neighbor shook his head in disbelief. How did no one notice this before? How did he manage to carry a child all the way here without anyone noticing? Jacob stood a little way off, still clutching the bag of bread against his chest, watching the scene unfold, as if watching his own fear materialize. With every passing second, more people approached, forming a circle around the officer protecting the victim and the handcuffed man, now with his head down, unable to bear the weight of the angry looks piercing through him. The ambulance finally arrived, illuminating the alley with flashes of red and blue light. Paramedics rushed to the cart, carefully removed the child, and began first aid right there on the cold street. The sound of the oximeter, the opening of medical bags, the snap of Velcro on the equipment filled the room with the urgency of someone racing against time. At that moment, the crowd could no longer contain itself. Voices rose in indignation, some in tears, others in fury. "He's a monster," someone shouted. "That man should rot in jail," another shouted, and the chorus of outrage took over, as if each person wanted to expel the darkness that had infiltrated the neighborhood. Jacob, though gripped by fear, simultaneously felt a spark of relief. The truth was laid bare for all to see, and no one could deny it. But there was still something inside him that made him shrink. He didn't want to be the center of attention, didn't want to be seen as the boy who risked everything to follow a stranger. His fight wasn't for recognition, it was for the certainty that this child would have a chance to survive. As the criminal was placed inside the police car, amid shouts of rage, Jacob turned his eyes to the child being carried away on a stretcher. There was a quiet calm in knowing she was still breathing, that his act of courage had not been in vain. But a question lingered in the air, echoing like an unanswered doubt. Would anyone discover that all of this was only possible because a black boy, invisible to so many, saw what no one else wanted to see? The movement in the alley was no longer marked solely by curiosity or the tension of the previous few minutes. Now, every step taken, every glance exchanged carried a different weight, the weight of gratitude mixed with indignation. Gratitude for the rescue, for the life saved, for the end of a nightmare before it could come to fruition. Indignation at the possibility that all of this had gone unnoticed, that a silent tragedy was being pushed beneath the asphalt like so many others. The rescued child was placed in the ambulance with extreme care, wrapped in blankets and delicate gestures from paramedics who knew what it meant to be faced with a life narrowly saved. The siren wailed again, cutting through the air like a cry of urgency, but at the same time like a promise of hope, as the vehicle sped off toward the nearest hospital. Amid the confusion of voices, shouts, and hurried footsteps, a detail began to emerge from the crowd. Everyone wanted to know who had called the police, who had given the first alert, who had been able to see what no one else had. That's when one of the officers, with a watchful eye, turned to Jacob, who stood there, his expression serene, still clutching the bag of bread as if it were his only defense against the world. The officer approached, bent down to the boy's level, and with a firm but visibly emotional voice declared, "Kid, if it weren't for you, we would be dealing with an irreparable loss right now. You did something extraordinary. You saved a life." The words seemed to echo within Jacob as if they had broken the silence of years of invisibility. Throughout his childhood, he had been the one adult scolded for making things up, the boy his schoolmates mocked for being too quiet, too sensitive, too attentive. But now, there, before a uniformed police officer and a scenario he had helped change, his tears finally allowed themselves to fall, not as a sign of weakness, but as an expression of something greater, the recognition that his intuition had overcome indifference. The arrival of the rescued child's family added a new weight to the scene. The mother, upon seeing her son being removed from the ambulance alive, ran toward the police, desperate but relieved. Upon learning that it was a boy who had noticed and called the authorities, she didn't hesitate. She fell to her knees before Jacob, grabbed his small hands, and between sobs of pain and gratitude, said with a trembling voice, "You saved my son. I can never thank you enough for what you did." Jacob didn't know how to react. His body remained motionless, his eyes watering, his heart pounding, as if trying to understand if all of this was real or just another thought in his restless head. He wasn't seeking applause. He never had. All he did was follow that strange impulse that grew within him, that nagging certainty that something was wrong and that someone needed to act. Meanwhile, the neighbors were beginning to look at each other. Many whispered to each other, embarrassed that they had never noticed who Jacob really was. Others simply watched, in silence, as if the image of that boy with the bag of bread in his hands and his unwavering gaze in the face of tragedy forced them to reflect on how blind they had been. Suddenly, the boy who had always gone unnoticed began to be seen. Not because he shouted louder, but because he was the only one who saw when no one else did. The police officer, as he walked away, muttered to his colleagues, "This kid is a hero, and the most impressive thing is that he didn't even try to be one. He just did what was right." But Jacob, despite everything, didn't see himself as a hero. He remained silent, his eyes fixed on the back of the ambulance disappearing around the bend. His greatest relief was knowing that the child would have another chance. Even so, deep in his heart, a sense of unease began to form. Would the way they saw him now last beyond this night? Or would he, once the lights went out and the news changed the subject, return to being just another ignored face in the crowd? Because, in the end, what he wanted wasn't fame, but for the world to truly begin to see the silent voices, like his, before it was too late. As the ambulance disappeared around the bend in the street, carrying the rescued child with it, the silence that fell was not only one of relief, but of reflection. The alley still bore the marks of the event, the tarp lying on the ground, the abandoned stroller, the tearful looks of neighbors in disbelief. And at the center of it all remained Jacob, the boy who, dared to see when everyone else turned away. The story of that day wasn't just about a foiled crime. It was, above all, about how society insists on ignoring small voices, especially when those voices belong to black children from marginalized communities. How many times have Jacob's words been dismissed as figments of imagination? How many times have his sharp and sensitive observations been dismissed without even a careful listen? The scene in the alley was painful proof that often lives can depend on those who are invisible to the world. Jacob, in his innocence, wasn't seeking glory, but his actions raised uncomfortable questions. Why did he have to go to such extreme lengths, nearly losing a life, for his voice to be taken seriously? How many other Jacobs, scattered throughout cities like Baltimore, live in silence, suffocated by disbelief and adult neglect? The weight of this truth weighed heavily on everyone present, and none of those present could pretend to be blind. The looks cast at the boy at that moment were not just of gratitude, but of belated recognition. Every neighbor, every adult who had previously treated him with disdain, now saw in him a strength they had never imagined. It was a silent, discreet force, but one capable of changing someone's destiny. And this contrast between everyday invisibility and sudden relevance was at once beautiful and cruel. The scene also exposed a broader reality, the need to learn to listen. Not just children, but all those who, because of their race, social status, or age, are constantly silenced. Jacob had proven that truth can be born precisely from silence, and that courage lies not in shouting louder, but in persisting even when no one believes you. As the sun advanced across the sky, illuminating the alley marked by the event, Jacob remained motionless, reflecting inwardly. He didn't know if his life would change from that moment on, if people would listen to him with more respect. But he felt a flame burning. Within him, the certainty that he had done what needed to be done. And this flame, silent but powerful, was the true mark of a hero who sought not titles, but only justice. That morning's episode offered a clear lesson. Never underestimate those who observe in silence. Never dismiss the insight of those who seem invisible, because in decisive moments, it is these watchful eyes that can save lives. And as the residents slowly returned to their homes, taking with them the unforgettable image of the uncovered cart, a question hung in the air, almost like a voice that echoed within each one. If that morning Jacob dared to see what no one wanted to see, what could he still discover in silence, in the forgotten streets of the city? The morning in Baltimore had begun like so many others, but ended marked by an event no one would ever forget. The silent alley still bore the marks of tension, the torn tarp on the ground, the empty cart pushed aside, the marks of hurried footsteps etched into the asphalt. It was as if the space had become a living testament to what a boy's silence could reveal. Jacob stood there, holding the now cold and crumpled bag of bread, staring at the spot where the ambulance had disappeared minutes before. The world around him seemed to be going on as usual, but inside him, something had changed forever. It wasn't just the sense of accomplishment, but the realization that, even unseen by so many, his courage had saved a life. The weight of disbelief that had accompanied him all this way seemed lighter, replaced by a flame of certainty that burned within him. People still murmured his name, some in surprise, others in reverence. The police officer, now silent, kept his eyes fixed on the boy as if he understood he had just witnessed an act of heroism that required neither uniform nor medals. Jacob wasn't seeking recognition, but in that moment, he carried with him something that could never be taken away. The knowledge that his sensitivity was valuable, that his attention to the invisible could transform destinies. The story of that day didn't end with just the rescue of a child. It expanded as a warning to all who witnessed it, and also to those who would hear the story later. How often a similar voice is silenced? How many tragedies could be avoided if we had the courage to listen more, to look beyond the rush, to value the insights of those who seem too small to be heard? Jacob, still silent, walked home again. The bag of bread, once a symbol of his everyday routine, now represented the memory of a day when he stopped being just an invisible boy and became, unintentionally, an unsung hero. As he crossed the corner, the sun illuminated his tired but serene face, and it was possible to imagine that inside his mind there was only one certainty. No matter how much the world tries to silence his voice, there will always be value in seeing what no one sees. And perhaps this is the greatest message of this story. Heroes don't wear capes, nor do they receive applause at the end of the day. Often, they walk the streets with ordinary bags in their hands, crossing sidewalks like any other child. But they carry within them the quiet courage capable of transforming everything. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade into obscurity. Subscribe to the channel now and follow each new episode, because there are other stories of courage that will challenge you to see the world through new eyes. The next case will surprise you even more, and perhaps make you realize that all around you there are also invisible heroes ready to change destinies.